archangel from heaven, let's say Michael or Gabriel, appeared to you and said, "Your prayer has been heard," how do you think that would make you feel? Well, we have that actually in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verse 13, when the angel Gabriel appeared to Zechariah and says, "Don't be afraid, your prayer has been heard." Well, how do you suppose Zechariah felt? He just said, "Prayer? What prayer?" Well, says Gabriel, "You and your wife Elizabeth prayed for a son." Well, yeah, that was years ago, 20, 30 years ago. And I'm an old man, and my wife is too old to have a child. How could this be? Well, Gabriel says, "All I know, I've been sent from heaven to tell you, your prayer has been heard. And your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son. You will call his name John." And yet Gabriel wanted to argue back. This is not possible. This couldn't be. I can't think of anything more stupid than to argue with an angel. But that's what he did. But it turns out that even though this man, Zechariah, didn't believe a word Gabriel was saying, the prayer was going to be answered. There are two things I want to say about prayer. Number one, any prayer that is prayed in the will of God will be answered. Now, we learn this from the Gospel of John, when John says, if we ask anything according to his will, the Lord hears us. In other words, in order to be heard in heaven, you've got to pray in God's will. The thing is, we could pray in God's will and not be conscious that we are praying in God's will. Well, years ago, I suppose, in the early days of the marriage of Zechariah and Elizabeth, they asked the Lord to give them a son. Well, what they couldn't have known, God heard them, and God said yes. But he didn't tell them that. Why? Well, that's another question. But the point is, they were heard. And it is possible to put a request to God, and we have no conscious awareness that he has heard our prayer. Well, that's what happened to Zechariah and Elizabeth. It turns out 20 years, 25, maybe 30 years later, they're told that their prayer was heard. And that's the angel Gabriel giving this information. Well, that's the first principle. Any prayer prayed in the will of God will be answered. But then there's the second principle. The shape answered prayer takes is determined by our readiness at the time God steps in. And what happened in the case of Zechariah, he wasn't ready. Far from it. He didn't even believe it. And what is interesting, Zechariah's unbelief did not stop God from answering the prayer. It did not abort the process. The prayer was going to be answered. In fact, here's what Gabriel said. "Look, Zechariah, before I go back to heaven, I've got an unpleasant duty to perform. You're going to be struck dumb and not able to speak because you don't believe what I've said. And yet it will be answered. It will be answered." Well, any prayer prayed in the will of God will be answered. But the shape it takes is determined by our readiness at the time. And sadly, Zechariah wasn't ready. And the angel Gabriel said, "You're going to be struck dumb and not able to speak." And that's exactly what happened. From that moment, Zechariah could not speak. And yet, what would have been most wonderful news, glorious news, thrilling news, was now under a cloud, and he wasn't able to enjoy what he used to look forward to so much, what normally would have made him so happy. But now he can't enjoy it, because the shape answered prayer takes is determined by our readiness at the time. What that means is, don't stop praying. Don't stop believing until God says no, and he can, in an undoubted way, well, this cannot be answered. But until you get that, assume that God might be saying yes. and you will have the joy of answered prayer when the day comes that God does step in and answer.